Probably. I mean, the real answer, to be honest with you, is I don't know. I don't know for two reasons. Number one, of course, I'm not looking at your contract. And number two, I don't know what the prime says. But here's why I say you probably do care. Because most commercial subcontracts will list the documents that comprise the contract documents, capital C, capital D, contract documents, which is a defined term, to which you, as the subcontractor, are bound. And usually, in the vast majority of cases, the prime contract between the general and the owner is one of those contract documents. Okay, so I think from the first part, you're going to be bound by the prime contract to some extent or another. The next question is, well, okay, even if you're bound, does it make a difference to you? Probably does. But you won't know until you actually review the prime contract. But here are a couple provisions that you should be aware of, and they probably appear in your subcontract. The first one says that in the event of a conflict in the terms of your subcontract, the one that you're signing, and the prime contract, the terms of the prime contract control. All right. Well, you better know what controls. You better know what conflicts. You have to know what the inconsistent terms are, because that's what you're going to be bound to, whatever's in the prime. Another provision that might appear as part of the conflict language is not that the prime necessarily controls, but it says that in the event of a conflict in terms between any of the contract documents, the more stringent or the term imposing the highest duty on you is going to control. And again, you won't know what the other term is, whether it's more or less stringent, unless you see what's in the prime. The second provision that really matters when it comes to a question of the prime is what's known as the flow down provision. And it says that you as the subcontractor are bound to the general contractor to the same extent as the general is bound to the owner under the prime. Because you see, the general contractor doesn't want any daylight between its obligations to the owner and your obligation to it. Why? Because it wants to pass all the risk, at least applicable to your work, down to you. So it doesn't want a gap. General contractors hate gaps. Because in the gaps, who has to fill in? The general does. They hate that. So between the conflicts and the flow down provision, it says you're bound by the prime. And even the concessions or the compromises that you may have negotiated in the subcontract may not apply if they're in conflict with what's ever in the prime. So here are a couple options that you ought to consider. The first is you ask for the prime. You ask to see it. And you don't care if the general contractor wants to redact certain things, their contract sum or terms that don't apply to you. That's fine. But if they won't show it to you, if they say we're not going to show it to you, then really what you've got to do is delete the prime contract from that laundry list of documents making up the contract documents to which you're bound. And that's an easy conversation to have with the general. To just say, look, we can't sign an agreement that says we're bound to terms we've never seen before. Usually, the general will send you a copy of the prime or make it available on a website or through a link. Now, you also have options once you see the prime and if you don't like the terms. You can say in the flow down provision, remember the flow down provision, that's the one that says you as the sub are bound to the general to the same extent that the general is bound to the owner and the prime. You just add a couple simple words. Except as specifically stated in this subcontract agreement, we as the sub are bound to you as the general to the same extent that you're bound to the owner and the prime. Except as specifically stated in the subcontract agreement. What that means, of course, is that any negotiated changes you might have inserted into the subcontract agreement stay. They're not wiped out by the flow down provision. Now, the conflict provision has another couple challenges. First, I don't like those clauses that say that the more stringent or the highest duty will prevail. Tell me what my responsibility is. Write it down. Don't make anybody guess. Don't make anybody compare documents. Tell me what it is. I want the standard of care right there in my subcontract agreement, and that's the standard I'm going to adhere to. The second thing is that you may not be successful arguing to the general that in the event of a conflict between the prime and the subcontract agreement you're signing, that all of the terms of the subcontract agreement apply. That may be your first position. You may go for that, but you may not be successful. So there's another choice, because it's not a binary calculation. It's not either the prime or the sub is going to control. You can say that in the event of a conflict between the prime contract and the subcontract agreement with regard to warranty, payment terms, standard of care, scope of work, and schedule, the subcontract agreement prevails. With regard to everything else, the prime prevails. And that way, you've given the general contractor, and by extension the owner, a victory of sorts. You haven't taken everything. You haven't said it's all or nothing, my way or the highway. What you've said is, look, these are the clauses we need to control. And by the way, what I gave you is a bunch of examples. It may not be the full laundry list. I mean, for you, there may be assumption of risk. There may be other things where you've negotiated changes, indemnification, damages, limitation of liability. You may have negotiated certain changes in the subcontract agreement, and you need those to stick around. You can't have them wiped out because they're in conflict with the prime. But you can go to the general and say, look, we understand you need the prime to control with regard to certain things. So let's identify what those are. But for our negotiated changes, they're going to stick. And so you make sure you revise the conflict provision. So the bottom line is, yeah, you probably do care what the prime says, but you don't have to accept what the prime says.